Um, so really, just to start with, we're going to look at the picture in very basic terms. So what are we looking at here? And as I said, please do butt in if you want to. But we're looking at a man and a woman in an interior, and there are a number of objects within the room which we're going to look at in much closer detail. We can see there's a bed on the right, there's a bench at the back, there's a chair between the bed and the bench at the back, there's a very, very conspicuous convex mirror right at the center of the wall there at the back, a chandelier hanging above it, an open window on the left, a chest beneath the window, and two pairs of shoes on the floor. There's one in the foreground there, a pair in the foreground, and a pair of red ones towards the back of the painting there, which sort of overlap an Oriental sort of style rug, which lies on this sort of wooden boarded floor. There's a panelled roof. The room feels quite small. And there's a strong light source that's coming in from the open window, which has no glazing in the bottom half, but has glass panes, sort of circular glass panes in the top half of the window. By way of introduction, this painting was painted by a man called Jan van Eyck in 1434. And what's so famous about this painting is that we really know very little about it. It's been a point of discussion for scholars for centuries, really, but it is very well documented as having been in a number of royal collections. It's first documented in 1516, being in the collection of Margaret of Austria, and it's the first painting that's listed in her inventory. And this inventory entry lists it as depicting, or it's the painting of Arnolfini de Fin. So it gives this kind of play on Arnolfini, Arnold de Fin. Now we know the Arnolfini were a very successful merchant family living in Bruges, originally from Lucca, trading in mainly silk and fruits in Bruges in the sort of second or in the 15th century. And in the second half of the 15th century, we know that there are 5 brothers in Bruges, sort of from this family, sort of amongst our cousins. So it's pretty clear that, well, we think that this is a member of the Arnolfini family. And as I say, the painting was with Margaret of Austria. It then moved into the Spanish royal collections, and then in the 19th century it came into the hands of a Scottish soldier who had been fighting the Peninsular War, and then the painting comes over to England and was on display in the early 1840s in the British Institute, before being bought by the National Gallery as its first sort of Netherlandish painting in 1842, and has been at the National Gallery ever since. So I thought we'd start by looking very closely here at the inscription above the mirror here, this very elaborate inscription, which says Johannes de Eyck fuit Eyck, which means Johannes van Eyck was here. So, and then beneath it, it says 1434. So this is in itself an incredibly curious inscription to include in a painting, mainly because normally at this point, paintings weren't necessarily inscribed, they weren't necessarily signed, but they also, if they were signed with a name. They weren't signed with such a statement, or they were signed with a moral. They weren't signed with someone saying Johannes van Eyck was here. It's a very unusual inscription. So this immediately brings confusion to the composition. Why was Johannes van Eyck here? Is he saying Jan van Eyck was here, he painted the picture? Is he saying Jan van Eyck was here in reference to the mirror below? Now, this brings me on to talk about this absolutely fantastic, elaborate, convex mirror, which has been executed in such beautiful detail by Van Eyck. And I think at this point, looking in detail at the picture, we really come to see Jan van Eyck's technique as a pioneer of using oil paint. So before this point, artists were using colored pigments mixed with egg yolk and water, which would bind them very, very quickly to the surface on which they were painting. So they would dry very quickly. Whereas the introduction of oil paint around the early 15th century in the Low Countries meant that you were able to really blend colors. You had much longer, you could paint wet on wet, and you could blend colors to give an effect of the transition of light or tones in surfaces. So here we have this incredible convex mirror, which we know from infrared scans of the pictures that this mirror was originally drawn much larger. So beneath the painting is an underdrawing, and it depicts the mirror as much larger than it was. So he's shrunk the mirror down. But what he's done is he's included these incredibly detailed roundels depicting the Passion of Christ, the condemnation of Christ under Pontius Pilate, in 10 scenes around the edge of this concave mirror. So you have at the bottom, right at the bottom, you have sort of the early stages of the Passion, and it moves all the way around to the crucifix at the top, and from the crucifix round to the bottom, you have the resurrection sort of at 5 o'clock. So on the right hand side of the mirror, you have the Passion, the scenes of death. You see the Pietà, the descent from the cross. And then on the left hand side, you see Christ under Pontius Pilate, the carrying of the cross, the flagellation. So you have Christ living. So this is immediately interesting in reference to a theory that this portrait is a portrait painted in memory of this man, Giovanni Arnolfini's dead wife, who we know his wife had died certainly by the year before this painting was painted, because the Passion, the death scenes are on the right-hand side of the roundel, which is the half of the picture in which the lady stands, and the living scenes are on the left-hand side, which is the half of the picture in which Giovanni stands. Added to which, if I move up to the chandelier, which is so incredibly beautifully painted above, you see the burning candle above Giovanni. He's still burning, and this not just empty chandelier candle holder here on the chandelier, but a burned out candle with wax kind of dripping over the end. So this implication that that this lady, who is so unbelievably idealized and clearly not painted from life, might be dead, is quite, I think, quite a convincing one, and one of the sort of more recent interpretations of this scene. But just to move back to the mirror, perhaps now's a time to bring anyone else who wants to talk in. What can you see in this roundel? Can anyone see?
It's a selfie. He selfied himself, hasn't he?
Bang on. First ever selfie. Exactly. So it's a reflection of what's happening in the room. But what's amazing is it compresses the scene into a tiny little mirror, but it actually expands it at the same time, not only because of this sort of fisheye convex lens, but also because the room extends back towards us. And what can you see right at the end, sort of where we are? What are we looking from? Well, there's an aperture in the wall, isn't there? So it's like a door into the room, and you have a sense that this man in blue is entering, and behind him a man in red is entering, and behind that you can see there is a little glimmer of light. So there's even a window beyond, in the room beyond, i.e. behind us, that is depicted. So the level of detail is just completely extraordinary. And you can see, of course, Giovanni and his wife, the posterior view of them, and even the detail, goes to the shutters, where you can see that there's one folded in the center and two that are slightly pushed out. And if you move to the left of the painting, here you see the top shutter is slightly open, the middle shutter is sort of recessed, and the bottom shutter is slightly open, which he's reflected accurately here in the reflection in the mirror. You can also see the bed here. It's interpreted that this figure in blue coming through the door may be Jan van Eyck, hence Jan van Eyck fuit hic, he was here, and that his servant, who he would have had at the court of the Duke of Burgundy, would have followed him sort of where he was going. I think the interpretation of the memorial portrait is very interesting because it also ties into the inscription saying Jan van Eyck was here. There's a kind of awareness that his life is fleeting as images and mirrors are fleeting, but he's kind of fixed himself within this mirror. He's sort of encapsulated himself within the mirror as being a permanent fixture, as it were. So even though his life has moved on, he is sort of, he's memorialized in this painting. So there's a kind of vanitas reference, a reference to his, to death, which of course was common in the 15th and 16th century, these references to the fleeting nature of life. The muddy shoes are such a lovely detail as well, because these are what are known as patterns with no R, and they were sort of wooden clogs that were they were used from the sort of Middle Ages to the early 20th century as a kind of overshoe, which you would slip over your sort of leather boot, which you can see ends here at his ankle. And they were to keep you out of all the muck, the animal and human muck in the streets. And you can see he's caught a lot of the muck on the bottom, and he's sort of kicked them off as he's come in. But just such a lovely detail with the shadow cast here. And then you see at the back, the rather more sort of modern looking Diamante studded gold, red and gold patterns of the lady, which are of course smaller and more dainty and delicate, probably studded with brass. So thank you very much for joining, and as I say, if there's anything else, let me know. But have a good weekend, and thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Love you.